Can you give the up-to-date corporate media narrative on COVID? Can you steel man their argument, or not even their argument? Can you steel man their narrative at all?
Well, sure. I mean, lockdowns work, mask mandates work, vaccines are safe and effective. I mean, this is the narrative. But you can go back. I mean, the studies now, looking. I mean, obviously, like you mentioned earlier, you can find studies that go either way, right? On any of these issues, there's always some controversy in all these policies. But it's not as though, and there's a lot of cherry picking. I mean, like you mentioned, we're being gaslighted, right? And it's like our own experience tells us one thing, and you can look at the epidemic waves. Look at the data across states, and it doesn't matter what policies they had or when they were implemented or whether they were implemented. The virus is going to do what it's going to do.
Yes.
The epidemic wave is the epidemic wave, and the policies make no difference. I mean, we can see that right in the data. It's so clear. I mean, you can't compare states and say, oh, well, obviously this state had lockdowns and mask mandates and this one didn't. You can't even compare. There's no way you could look at the data and like guess which states did what and when.
Right.
It's impossible because they have there's no obvious effect. And there's studies showing that. I mean, obviously, like I said, there's studies that say that they say, oh, well, these findings support the lockdowns or these findings support mask mandates. But there's other studies that don't find associations between lockdowns and better outcomes. In fact, you can even find associations between the more stricter lockdown measures, and worsened mortality. It increased mortality, not decrease of mortality, which actually makes sense because what you're doing with the lockdown measures is you're essentially postponing the inevitable. If you remember back at the beginning, it was all about flattening the curve, right? We were told 3 weeks or 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That was what the public was told. That's how the measures were sold to the public, as a temporary measure just to prevent hospitals from becoming overwhelmed. And the thing was, the argument wasn't that, oh, we're going to prevent cases. We're going to prevent deaths in the long run. The only way they were aiming to prevent deaths was to prevent people from not being able to get care in hospitals because the hospitals are overwhelmed. That was the only way they were going to prevent mortality, not by preventing cases.
Right.
And so if you looked at the area under the curve, whether, they had the models, right? And there was the big high peak without the lockdowns that they modeled versus the flatter wave with the lockdowns. The area under the curves were the same either way. But then the narrative shifted, and the whole logic behind it shifted. And then they're saying, oh, well, we can actually reduce the area under the curve with these measures, which is totally ludicrous. That was never what they were intended to do. But the politicians kind of took it on and said, oh, well, that's our new policy goal. And they shifted it. And they shifted the goalposts. And then so they became permanent, right? They become semi-permanent, where it was just like they never ended. It was 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And then it's like, oh, well, now we're just going to maintain these in place until there's a vaccine and we can mass vaccinate the population. And so just this way they're shifting their goalposts is also revealing as to their lack of credibility and their untrustworthiness.